Doing research in your own institution can pose significant ethical challenges. Dr. Kevin Williams of the Centre for Lifelong Learning at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, shares his research on the ethical issues facing research practitioners and his experience working with colleagues doing research in their own backyard.
Ethics have always been an issue for me. I started off life as a paramedic, and for the first time I actually heard the word ethics, and we started getting taught very fundamental ethics about patient confidentiality. And then in my work as a sociologist, inevitably with research, we heard a bit about ethics, but most of that was survey stuff, so it was pretty wide. Then when I did my PhD, and I was working with patients and with pharmacists, the sensitivity around research ethics really came home to me. This was now interviews. We were dealing with very personal data. Many of the patients that I was dealing with were people that I discovered that I knew. The patients were selected by a specialist physician according to their disease states and got presented to me. And I suddenly discovered I knew many of these people personally. Some of them I actually worked with. And so we had to negotiate participation, and we had to think very carefully about what one of those things meant. The mere fact that I knew they had this disease state immediately gave me some knowledge about them that they had not revealed to me previously. And that was quite an uncomfortable thing when I would knock on their office door and say, you know, Dr. So-and-so's approached you to be part of a research project. He did mention my name in the process, but I don't know if you realize that here I am to talk to you about it, you know, and that raised the sensitivity, the broadness, the wideness of the problem of research ethics, way beyond simply following the code. And I've become quite cynical about codes of ethics, because frequently I believe that they're more there to protect the institution than they are to protect those who are subjects of research. But up until then, I had just relied very comfortably. Well, you know, we've done the informed consent, we've followed the rules, and that's fine. But I suddenly became aware of the very personal impact of research on the lives of individuals. When I took up this new post at the University of Cape Town, there was a gap on the University Ethics Committee, and I was sort of, as the newbie, was stuck in it because nobody wanted to do it. And the group of us that got together the first meeting of the year, when we looked at the research ethics systems that we had to work with, we were all very conscious that these systems were inadequate. And we were challenged by our faculty board to present something better. And that formalized the process that had started with my PhD. It formalized the process of needing to look very carefully at research ethics. And that turned out in conversing with my colleagues at tea times about what they'd done about their research. And I noticed, for example, that many of them hadn't actually put their research through the Research Ethics Committee. Their names weren't there and their projects weren't there. And so I started asking them about that. And out of that conversation came stories that they shouldn't have told. And so I decided to turn the tables on them and ask them to become the subjects of research. I know that there's discomfort around this word subject and object, but I want to stick with the word subject of the research. And I started researching. I wasn't thinking necessarily of the idea of researching in my own backyard. One of the respondents actually said to me in the end, this is about researching in our own backyards. My issue was that we possessed this knowledge of each other that informed our decisions even if we thought it didn't, and we needed to be aware what was happening. In the paper, I talk about this insoluble problem of the agency of subjects, where we got to really recognize, so many of us approach our research project as our research project. This is ours. We determine what goes on here. We control what goes on here. Once it's got through all the necessary committees, this is ours. It's what we've been waiting to do. Or alternatively, it's what we've got to do because it's publish or perish. And we name this research space as our research. we say to people, would you mind being part of our research project or my research project? And in that process, we forget that people will have their own understandings of this research space. And one of the things that I noticed in the paper is my colleague who'd done some research in a very sensitive area in South Africa where I'm situated, and it was the area of race, the race of lecturers and the influence of their race on assessment. Now, that's a highly sensitive area, and it was done not very long after the fall of the apartheid government and the beginning of some kind of democratic structures in this country. And as he sat with people who he'd known for years, because he himself had been a student here at the university and a lecturer here for about 20 years, as he sat with them now as a researcher, he kept saying to them, I need you to read and sign the informed consent letter. And they were saying, oh, not a problem, just give it to me, I'll sign it. And he said to them, but you haven't read it. And they said, no, it's not a problem. We understand that, I mean, you're not giving me medicine, you're not going to hurt me in any way, so it's no problem. And there was almost the sense in which because these were experts in themselves, who had expert understandings of what research ethics mean, they were actually not paying attention to research ethics. And it's one of the problems that I think we face as practitioners researching in our own backyard, is that people are themselves experts. They think they know. And so they take it quite lightly because they assume that their assumptions about ethics are the same as your assumptions about ethics. They assume that their data analysis tools are going to be the same as your analysis tools. For scientists, for engineers, and for accountants, and for economists, they have no idea what's going to happen to that text in the hands of somebody who's going to do critical discourse analysis, and suddenly find themselves peeled back in ways that horrify them. They will say, but I didn't say that. And you sit down and talk with them through what the data analysis process was, and they're often shocked to the core that what you're saying actually has a legitimate basis, and they suddenly see themselves in a way that they had not seen before, which sometimes makes them very angry, sometimes makes them very vulnerable, sometimes says, no, I want to withdraw from this project and don't come near me again. And you find yourself caught in this position as people take my research project and they do with it what they want to do with it. They disagree with my methods. They disagree with my findings. They disagree with what I've done to them. And it leaves me in quite a difficult position. And I think one of the first things we've got to begin to realize as researchers is it's not my research project. It's our research project. One example has just happened to me in this last week. It's not in the paper. One of my research students, PhD student, quite a new member of staff, is doing some research on student learning in her faculty. Very innocent. She's just looking at what it is that made some students succeed in what has been, for many students, a very difficult program. So she's taken a group of students and said, what is it that's made you succeed? What she did not expect was to find herself in sitting down with students in the interview, sobbing their hearts out because they had been racially abused by one of the senior professors. What she did not expect was students telling of sexual harassment by tutors. She didn't expect to find that. She wasn't ready for it. She had it technically covered in her ethical documents and in her informed consent. But now suddenly she found herself sitting in the same tea room with the same people who her respondents had just revealed desperate information about. Now, what does she do? Does she reveal that information? Does she take it up to the university's harassment bodies? Does she say to the students, you must take it up to the harassment bodies, when the students had already chosen not to do so? Must she keep that information confidential? Because if she reveals that information, if she approaches her head of department or her dean or the lecturers concerned, she makes the students themselves vulnerable. She's at risk of being accused of what in our country would be criminal injuria, criminal insult to the person, damage to the person through the use of words. I believe that would be termed else in other ways in other countries. But she suddenly finds herself trapped in a very uncomfortable ethical space where rules, ethics, the rules of the community, are suddenly overturned by morals, her own character, her own set of values. And it's paralyzed her in her research. She just doesn't know how to go further. And it places the two supervisors in a very difficult position too, because now we also know that information. And we also have had to make decisions about how we're going to go forward with this and how we're going to recommend to our student, who also happens to be a colleague, how to go forward with this. Ethics catches you by surprise. It sneaks up on you in unexpected ways. It's always what you didn't prepare for. And it really leaves you paralyzed. These ethical dilemmas. We don't carefully consider enough the ramifications of researching in our own backyards. When I wrote this paper, this paper that was published in London Review, I first put it together for a conference, a local, international conference that was held locally. It became a conference paper. It became a journal article. And then, most difficultly, the dean of the faculty asked me to present the paper at a faculty seminar where the very same people were present. But out of that faculty seminar was a very serious proposal by a group of younger lecturers that we no longer participate in research in our own institution, because they felt that the burden of ethics was too strong for us to bear. Now, inevitably, that led to great debate, and it led to great debate in our faculty board. And the decision was to go against that and say, no, we have to continue researching in our own institution, but we have to be far more cautious about it than we've been previously. But yes, it scares one off, I think, when you have a brush with this. One of my first questions was with an experienced researcher, a person older than myself, although who had not at that stage completed their PhD for a whole lot of reasons associated with South Africa's history. So she was a woman in her 50s, lots of experience. And I came in for the interview and I sat down, and we knew each other quite well. I sat down at her desk and she said to me, I'm feeling so nervous, I'm shaking. And I said, but what are you feeling nervous about? She said, because you're coming to ask me about research ethics, and I feel like all my flaws are going to be exposed. I feel like you're looking at me in a critical and judgmental way. And I said, but I've already kind of discussed what we're going to be doing here, and you obviously can opt out at this point. She said, no, I don't want to opt out. I just want you to understand that I find discussion, just the discussion of my own research, very scary. And that was something that really surprised me. I didn't expect it. Firstly, I didn't think that I was that threatening. Secondly, because of all of her experience and the things that she'd been through, the last thing I would have expected was this would be threatening. But there we go. It was an unexpected thing. Another story was an immediate colleague of mine who was doing research on race and assessment. I mentioned that previously. And he was very conscious about the need to protect the implied confidentiality that people had in this process. And he'd really been very careful. He was a meticulous person and very sensitive because he'd been a victim of oppression and had been a victim of apartheid. He was very sensitive about these things. And he was saying that just a day or two prior to my interview with him, he'd sat down in an institutional meeting, quite a high-level meeting of heads of department and deans and senior management. And one of the people who was sitting there turned to him and said to him, "Hi, good to see you again." And he said, just for a split second, I couldn't remember who he was. And I'm going to read now from the transcript, which is not included in the paper. And for a split second, I hadn't seen this person. I don't know this person very well, and I hadn't seen them for a while, and I couldn't quite place them. So I'd forgotten that this person had been in an interview context. And I went forward to introduce myself, and she said to me, "Oh, yes, no, you interviewed me for your study, openly, publicly, to everybody present." And I realized that that I had just run ahead for a couple of seconds, and I hadn't thought to say to my students, to my subjects, "Please do not discuss the study with anyone." So that's the extract from the transcript. The last thing he expected was firstly, that he'd forget one of his interview respondents, and secondly, that one of his respondents would so openly, having had this research published as a PhD and as a paper, it was already out in the open, and people at the university were very aware of it and quite uncomfortable with it. Now to have suddenly somebody stand up and say, "Oh yes, I was one of your participants." And because everybody knew what faculty she was in, it didn't take an awful lot to work out which person she was, and they would understand what she'd said. In a sense, the respondent took unconscious control of the ethical commitment that he'd made and turfed it out the window. I said to this person, "What did you do about it? What do you think you can do about it?" And he said to me, and I'm quoting again from the transcript, "I never said to my interviewees, 'You cannot discuss the study.' What I said to my interviewees was, 'I will not be talking about the study to anybody else in your department, and they will not know I have interviewed you.' On the surface, people knew that I was interviewing a lot of people, but nobody else in the department knew who I was interviewing. And I said to people, 'I'm not going to talk about this interview to anyone in your department. I'm not even going to indicate that you were interviewed.' So that was the best that I could control. But I can't go and say to them, 'You may not talk about this research to anybody else.' I do not have the right to silence them about their experience of being researched." And he goes on to say, and this is in the paper, "I feel like I lost control. I didn't know what else to do. I could not insist that people not talk about the research. I felt that was a complete violation of their rights. So I never insisted that people not talk about, although I realized I was compromising other people's level of confidentiality. Yes, individuals didn't know who else had been interviewed, but just by the fact that it was our department that had been interviewed, well, I was very concerned about that." And I think that highlights one of the issues. The moment we're talking about doing research in our own department, in our own institution, maybe it's less so in the United States or in Europe, where you've got so many institutions, so many possibilities. But if I start talking about doing research in a major research-intensive university in South Africa, that limits it to 3. Now, guess what? He's actually appointed at one of those institutions. So what's the probability he's talking about that institution? And if I'm talking about a particular department, because we only have 30-odd higher education institutions in the country, and as I said, only 3 that are really research-intensive universities, anybody else in that field in the country will be able to say, "Oh, I recognize who that is because I know that department." So you face this absolute paralyzing fear of revealing information that you shouldn't reveal. And my sense of this is that sometimes we've just got to bite the bullet. and say to people up front, you know this context. You know this is going to be probably published in this journal. There will be other sociologists or anthropologists or whoever it is in the country who will read this journal, and they may well be able to identify you. So that's the best kind of, I need you to be informed about this, which may, of course, then mean when they reply, they're not going to give the answer that they would have given if they hadn't been cautioned. It may leave us sometimes with data that feels thin and flimsy and lacks the very richness that we always seek in qualitative research. But my choice, and I've got to stress this, that it's my choice. This is why I argue in the paper that ethics is an ontological issue. It's about me, it's about my being. My choice is that I would rather compromise the data and state that up front in the paper so that all readers understand that the data could have been compromised. I would rather compromise the data than compromise the unsuspecting person. And quite frequently when you are doing institutional research, they are editing themselves very carefully because they know where your position is, they know where their position is, they know about status, they know about who you have access to. We're actually engaged now with many of the same colleagues who were the interviewees, the respondents in this paper. We're engaged in a big national research project with colleagues from other universities who formed a research team. So the research team is about 25 people. And we have made a conscious decision not to do any interviews in our own institutions. In fact, not even in our own regions. We, from my institution, will do our interviews in another province, at institutions in another province, to try and some way militate against the kind of need to position ourselves as interviewers and for the respondents to position themselves because of our access to power in their institutions. Of course, it presents the other problem. They've got to cover their institutions while they're talking to some stranger from another institution. And so, yeah, I think it's very, very hard to escape the fact that qualitative research always sits at risk, that we've been led by the nose, that we've misunderstood, that we've been unclear. It's just so much easier to measure it and say that there were 120 people and 109 of them did this, so therefore. But qualitative research just doesn't allow us that gap. And we've got to use the data so carefully. We've got to be so aware of what's happening in the interviews. We've got to be so aware of the expressions, the intonations, the sense of the person sitting with us. That, and I cannot say to you this is the way you do it, but that's got to inform when you're looking at the data. That's going to inform. It's there in the back of your head while you're looking at the data and you're listening to the transcripts. You're going to be sitting there thinking, how strongly can I rest on these words? Do I have to reflect these words? And we use careful ways of saying this. So-and-so reports that this is the way they felt, rather than so-and-so felt this. So we find ways to frame our reporting that should warn any reader who's knowledgeable, be cautious with this data. But of course, that's my interpretation. And the reader, once I've written the text, the reader is liable to her own interpretation. She owns the text, not me. And how she will read it, whether she will read that as a cautionary statement or not, open to question. I think there's quite a lot of writing at the moment about research committees and ethics reviews. And that's partly because of the whole managerialist shift in higher education institutions, where ethics committees are often really management committees, concerned primarily to cover the institution's back rather than anything else. Where ethics, if you look carefully at the ethics forms and the letters of consent, they even serve that purpose. You get the sense that this is not about the subject or the respondent or the interviewee. It's actually about the institution. And in my own institution, we have a very large medical faculty, and they have very high standards of ethics. as do probably most medical faculties. They're very concerned about the ethics of animal testing, the ethics of injury to patients, the ethics of all that kind of thing. So we'll use these as a basis for our ethical guidelines. That's fine. But they do not create the possibility for understanding the kind of harm that comes from an interview, a phenomenological interview, where you sit deeply with somebody and talk at length and over time with them about one particular area of their lives. One of my students, who's doing a PhD in the preparation of critical care nurses to manage the death of their patients in the ward. And it involves really, really deep, in-depth interviews over a period of 2 years with people, talking about things that are raw in them. The Medical Ethics Guide doesn't begin to cover what happens to you when you are forced to reflect on how you managed the death of the first child in your neonate ICU. It doesn't begin to cover that. It will talk about whether procedurally you did all the right things, but it doesn't talk about what happens to you, the human inside of you. But we need to try and be as aware as we can, which is why I think that frequently in planning our research, we need to get other voices, other people to speak to our research, other people to look at what we're doing and saying, yes, but have you thought of this? Or have you thought of that? And how are you going to manage this? And how are you going to plan that? So that's one thing that we've tried to do. We've tried to encourage researchers to work with colleagues who are not involved in the project when they start looking at informed consent forms, when they start looking at survey questions, when they start looking at interview questions. We've tried to say to staff, please would you do that, and please would you note the names of the colleagues who you've referred to in your research application. And yes, that's a bit of Big Brother, and we're aware of that, but it's the best that we can do. I think research committees are risky. We trust them too much. They're made up of fallible people. We're all fallible. We sometimes look through that thing in a hurry and just say, yeah, that's fine, let it go. Sometimes we nitpick over one thing and we miss the elephant in the room. And if we trust those research committees and say, well, there we go, the research committee's passed it, it's fine, then we miss the fact that the burden of ethics actually sits on the character of the researcher. I think the thing to be aware of is to walk gently in research, to be humble in research. We're not seeking the answers. We're seeking people's reflections on their experiences of life. We're asking people to tell their story. We're asking people to make themselves variably vulnerable. We have to do with things that are not ours. We don't own the information that's given to us. It belongs to other people. So the first thing I would say to any new researcher is tread gently because you are walking on people's lives. That's the first thing I would say to you. The second thing I would say to you is work with another voice. Sit down with somebody who's a friend of yours and say to them, here, you're not in this research game. What do you think of these questions? What do you think? How do you feel about being asked these questions? Get other voices that are not going to be part of your project to speak to what's happening. It doesn't help to speak to your supervisor sometimes. Your supervisor's part of the game. Calluses are built up. We automatically make allowances. We do so without thinking. And it's only sometimes when you sit and talk through a letter of consent, line by line by line, that you suddenly realize that you've glossed over something and in your own head just corrected it without actually correcting it in substance. And I think that we've got to be very aware that when we're researching for a qualification, we are being selfish. We may want to hide that amongst all kinds of, well, this is for the greater good. The bottom line is we want the qualification. We're making use of these people for our qualification. That is pretty risky stuff ethically, even of itself. So we need to try and bring a deep humility to our research, particularly when it's for a qualification, and actually approach our respondents with a deep sense of gratitude. because they are really giving us a gift.